Everybody. This is welcome to this evening's webinar, which is an unusual one because we have one of the experts in the UK and one of the hidden experts in the UK on the subject of anti-Semitism and on the subject of security of the community, Danny Morris. I'm not going to introduce him in any great detail. You've seen on the blurb what his position is at the Community Security Trust, and I can tell you that the presentations I heard from him previously have answered, not obviously into this subject, all the questions, but many of the questions that have been of concern to me over the last in particular. So I hand over to Danny and welcome. And of course, as always, please put your questions onto the chat or into the Q&A, and he's been agreed to take questions at the end of the session.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David. Can you just let me know if you can see my screen?
Perfectly.
Great. All right. Good evening. And let me echo my personal thanks for all of you attending this session this evening. As David said, my name is Danny Morris, and I'm the Senior Research and Policy Analyst at CST, the Community Security Trust. I'll give a bit more context on the next slide. And I don't know if someone, I don't know if everyone's getting a bit of feedback, by the way. So if you can just mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. So the purpose of tonight's presentation is essentially to give you a bit of a update as to the current state of anti-Semitism, looking in the first half at some of what we've seen in regards to the pandemic and anti-Semitism, some of the conspiracy theories that we've been seeing at CST. And then the second half of the presentation is going to focus on some of what we've been seeing in the last few weeks. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been in the headlines, unfortunately, as in regards to what's been happening in the Middle East. And before I begin, just for the benefit of everyone, I think it's worth just spending a brief moment on introducing who CST are. So CST's primary function, as many of you may know, but some of you may not know, is to combat and protect the Jewish community from physical threats related to anti-Jewish terrorism primarily, and of course from anti-Semitism. And the work essentially stems from a long tradition of Jewish self-defense that was established in the shadow of the Holocaust. Here in the UK, that tradition began when Jewish ex-servicemen who returned from fighting fascism in Europe came back to the UK and encountered fascists on the streets of the UK, in particular Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts. And the Black Shirts were marching through Jewish areas, they were targeting Jewish businesses and Jewish individuals. And these group of ex-servicemen, as well as others from within the Jewish community, took it upon themselves to protect local Jewish communities from these threats and to stop the attacks. And as time went on and as we moved through the decades, the work developed, it evolved, it professionalized and adapted as the threats to the community adapted. And CST is essentially, we see ourselves as the modern incarnation of that work. And we exist today as a modern professional organization with just over 100 staff and around 2,500 trained security volunteers from within the community, who then obviously go out and protect Jewish communal locations, synagogues, Jewish events, etc. Many of you will be familiar with us. We're a national organization. We engage with all Jewish communities from Edinburgh to Exeter, from Brighton to Norwich, as well as all religious denominations. And we also represent the Jewish community on issues relating to terrorism and extremism, security, to the government and police. It's worth beginning with some brief context on what the Jewish community looks like. And I say, I know that this will all be very familiar to you. In the UK today, there's estimated to be around 300,000 Jews living throughout the UK, but mainly concentrated in the large population hubs of London, Manchester, Leeds, as well as other main cities, communities in Gateshead, for example. And it's important to start with this because this relatively small number of 300,000 means that about half the people in this country, about 35 million people, don't know any Jewish people. And this is really the first challenge when it comes to tackling anti-Semitism. This lack of familiarity with the community means there's little understanding about us, our history, our traditions, our culture, and importantly for today's presentation, the hate that can be directed against us. And this is despite many of the anti-Semitic tropes and themes we're going to explore having been around for centuries and having started here in England. And next is just the sheer variety of Jewish life and daily lived experiences. It's probably more instructive to talk about Jewish communities as opposed to a Jewish community. That said, if you read a newspaper article about anything Jewish or related to anti-Semitism, it will probably be illustrated with photographs like this. Images of individuals, of Jews who adhere to ultra-Orthodox and the more conservative traditions. And though individuals from these communities are often subject quite regularly to anti-Semitism due to being visibly Jewish, this also means that people very closely associate their understanding of what it is to be Jewish or what the Jewish community is through images like this. And it can be quite unhelpful because we know that in reality, Jews can also look like this, stemming from different backgrounds, levels of religiosity, heritage, and cultures. And the reason why it's important to understand this is because when talking more generally about racism, we'll often talk about visible minorities, but Jewish people can be visible or somewhere in between, invisible sometimes. And as a result, and importantly for tonight's presentation, this also means that anti-Semitism can be invisible, somewhere in between. When we think about racism, we often think of structural racism and concrete discrimination based on how someone looks or the color of their skin. And this still can affect Jewish people, but anti-Semitism is more often than not about ideas and ways of thinking, stereotypes and tropes that unfortunately have a long and terrible history. So I want to start with a brief example of what that history actually is. And I've been delivering this training for a while now, and I'll normally start with an image of some statues, and it's taken on quite a different meaning in light of last summer's events in relation to Black Lives Matter, but I still think it's worth using and may actually be even more pertinent now. And the statue that you can see on screen now is that of Richard I, or most commonly known as Richard the Lionheart, and it's located outside the Palace of Westminster, facing towards the entrance to the House of Lords. And in 1189, at his coronation, a series of violent riots or pogroms followed against Jewish communities across England. And what had happened was that a number of Jewish dignitaries had turned up to the coronation, hoping to attend, bringing gifts, and they weren't allowed entry, and they were subsequently beaten. As they fled, rumors spread, sort of an early form of fake news, that the new king had ordered Jews to be killed. He hadn't. And Jews in London were murdered, looted, in some cases converted against their will. And as reports of these attacks spread, more followed in other cities across England. A few months later, on the 16th of March, 1190, one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres occurred in York, in Clifford Tower. Many of you may have visited the location if you've been up to York, when the city's whole Jewish community were killed or forcibly converted. Some 150 Jews died. About 100 years later, in 1290, Jews were expelled from England by Edward I, the first European country to do so. And only 366 years later were Jews allowed back into England by Oliver Cromwell, whose statue you can see on the screen now. And this quite small example is one of many that could be told of similar and violent experiences for Jewish communities across Europe during this same period. And the reason why I started with this is because it tells us two things, two quite important things. One, this has been going on for quite a long time. And two, most people know nothing about it. And this is the challenge really when it comes to anti-Semitism. And once again, if we couple this with what I just said about the fact that there's actually very few people who know any Jewish people, and they don't know the history, and they don't understand anti-Semitism, when it comes to educating, when it comes to getting people to take anti-Semitism as seriously as it should be taken, this is the challenge. So it's at this point in the presentation where I'd usually focus on some of those historic tropes associated with anti-Semitism. But I thought it was worth some time, especially given the audience, to focus a little bit on the past year with a specific look at the pandemic and anti-Semitism. And I want to start with a brief video.
We got to make sure this is a genocide, and this is a Jewish genocide on us. Israeli people are not getting the vaccine. Categorically, I'm saying They're not giving the vaccine to people in Israel. They're giving them saline solution. And that's why we see stories, because as soon as I started saying that they're getting saline, I started saying this a while back. They're getting saline. They're not getting the vaccine. They're only getting saline. They're not going to give their people the Jewish poison. That's for goy, right?
So I hope you could hear that. It's bonkers, right? But the fact is, there are many people out there who believe and actively promote this type of messaging. Note use of the phrase Jewish poison. Many of you may be familiar with the concept of well poisoning or the phrase poisoning the well, a medieval accusation often leveled against Jews who were held responsible for deliberately infecting or spreading disease across cities. In many respects, this appears to be the same or a similar trope, Jews deliberately setting out to spread disease and plague. The question that naturally follows is, why do people believe this? And this is a question I get a lot. The answer is somewhat simple. At its core, anti-Semitism can be thought of as a conspiracy theory. Ideas and ways of thinking about the world that seek to blame Jews for everything bad that happens in it. From wars to financial crashes and terrorism, anti-Semites fundamentally believe that Jews are always to blame. It was therefore sadly predictable that when the pandemic hit, that some would promote the idea that Jews were to blame. And it's worth clarifying, just before I go into this section, that the idea that Jews were responsible for the pandemic didn't really spread widely. It's something largely promoted by fringe extremist groups and individuals, and it didn't really enter the mainstream. That said, I can distinctly remember the conversations that I had with colleagues when the pandemic began, where we speculated as to how anti-Semites and extremist groups would exploit the situation to promote their own narratives. And what we began to see was content like this: explicit messaging promoting the idea that Jews maliciously created the coronavirus. In fact, this image is actually meant to be a posters that users who are viewing it online, if they so wish, can print it out and post it in real life on the streets or wherever they live. And actually under the black square in the bottom right is a QR code which you can scan with your phone that actually links to a far right website. The idea being that someone would come across this poster, scan the QR code, and then being drawn into further information relating to the connection between Jews and the coronavirus. The next image is this one, where we can see soldiers whose heads have been replaced with the coronavirus, escorting forcibly the general population. What you may not have noticed is this at the back, a well-known and often used far-right caricature of a Jew known as the Happy Merchant. And this is it, you can see it more clearly here. Once again, the implication is clear. It is the Jew hiding in the shadows who is somehow using coronavirus for their own evil aims. We're all familiar with the concept of Jewish power, Jews using their money and influence to secretly control global events. This is exactly that, but within the context of the pandemic. In this one, we can see a microscopic image of a virus or the coronavirus, although in this case, they've been made to look like Jews. Note, however, in this one, the bars of gold in the top left of the image. Sometimes the conclusion of this type of content is left up to the viewer. Are they saying that Jews are a disease like coronavirus? Are they saying that coronavirus is a Jewish creation or a plot? Are the bars of gold there to denote that the coronavirus somehow linked to making Jews richer? What is for certain is that the image is anti-Semitic. And in this case, we see the anti-Semitic association between Jews and money being used once again within the context of COVID. At the most extreme end, we saw content like this, no longer now just promoting a connection between Jews and coronavirus, but actively encouraging individuals who are infected to, and I quote, spread the flu to every Jew, as you can read on screen. Essentially a very modern pandemic-focused way in which to promote the concept of killing Jews. And note the use of the term Holocaust at the bottom of the poster. What we've seen so far are images largely, or I think all of them are from far-right sources that mainly suggest that Jews are somehow responsible for the virus. But we've also seen images coming from pro-Iranian sources as well, making a comparison between Israel and the virus. In particular, we saw use of the term COVID-1948 to describe Israel, a witty play on COVID-19, changing the number to Israel's year of independence. Now, what does this imagery mean in practice? Well, we all understand that the coronavirus threatens the whole world. Every government is putting all of their resources into fighting and ultimately destroying or defeating it. There is no good side to the virus, only bad. And the analogy is obvious. Everyone in the world should also be scared of Israel and see Israel as a deadly threat to them. Ultimately, governments all over the world should work together to destroy or defeat Israel. It's anti-Semitic. One of the many unique markers of anti-Semitism is how easily it adapts, ironically, much like a virus, to suit the current context and reality. I also want to briefly show you some of the content we've been seeing in regards to the vaccination program. Once again, promoting the idea that Jews are secretly behind the vaccination program for their own malicious purposes, much like the video we saw just a few minutes ago. The image on screen now attempts to make the connection or the suggestion that Jews are responsible for promoting the implementation of vaccines. It seems like it's a positive image, but it's not. And the image is essentially making the suggestion that Jews have been or are plotting to use the vaccination programs, most likely as a means as population control or sterilization. And note the large needle in the center of the screen, surrounded by the Star of David and what appears to be blood dripping from the needle. Whether or not it's meant to be blood or not, that association between Jews and blood, perhaps an unconscious nod to the blood libel. In this image, we see the utilization of a grotesque Nazi-inspired caricature of a Jew, this time forcibly injecting a white woman with the vaccine. In fact, you can see the sign at the back of the image in the back left that's been crossed out, which reads intravenous sterilization trial lab. The suggestion being that the vaccination program is a front for forcible sterilization that targets white women. Why white women in particular? Well, this comes from a far-right source, and it's most likely a nod to something known as the Great Replacement Theory, a far-right conspiracy theory that alleges that white Western populations are being slowly replaced by non-whites, in particular Muslims. And of course, who is behind this effort to replace these populations? Well, obviously for the far right, it's the Jews who are behind it. It's this exact theory that inspired Robert Bowers to walk into a synagogue on Yom Kippur in October 2018 in Pittsburgh and murder 11 Jewish worshippers, because he believed that the synagogue was involved in the active replacement of the white American population. It's also worth remembering, and it's always worth remembering, that anti-Semitism is ultimately so dangerous because it leads to Jews being killed. Another quite unique element in the narrative between coronavirus and anti-Semitism has been the offensive and what CST and what we consider the anti-Semitic use of imagery related to the Holocaust from anti-vax and anti-lockdown individuals and groups. Most notably, this has come in the form of individuals wearing the same style of yellow star that Jews were forced to wear during the Nazi occupation of Europe. Not only is this deeply offensive and idiotic, but it represents a form of Holocaust denial that ultimately minimizes the experiences of Jews during that period. The suggestion being that somehow individuals subject to lockdown restrictions and vaccinations in 2021 are being treated the same as Jews under Nazi rule. It's absurd. So I want to spend the second half of this presentation focusing a bit more on contemporary anti-Semitism. I know this has been content from the past year, but looking obviously with a particular focus on the past few weeks. I know that there'll be particular interest on this issue. And anti-Semitism today, the daily lived experiences of Jews, is in essence CST's main focus, supporting the Jewish community deal with anti-Semitism, largely in the form of the incidents that get reported into us. And the past few weeks have seen countless media reports in regards to a global spike in anti-Semitism. We've had high-profile incidents being reported in London, New York, LA, and across Europe. Pretty much anywhere where you can find a Jewish community at the moment, there will be a fear and anxiety about this spike in anti-Semitism. And it has contributed to that general feeling of anxiety and fear for Jewish communities. We've heard from Jewish parents who are scared of sending their children to school. Jews unsure as to whether or not it's safe to visibly identify as Jewish in public, and Jewish women who feel unsafe going out on their own. So let's take a brief look at some of the incident figures. What you can see on screen now are the anti-Semitic incident levels recorded by CST over the past 12 years. This doesn't include 2021. And what may immediately draw your attention are those huge skyscraper months in 2009 and 2014. Those are the two previous months in which there was conflict involving Israel. In other words, anti-Semitic incidents skyrocket when there is conflict involving Israel. The graph obviously doesn't have this year's statistics added in yet, but I'm sorry to say that there will be the addition of a new spike that in some respects will dwarf the two previous months that you can see on screen now. May 2021 will represent CST's worst month on record for anti-Semitic incidents. Naturally, the question that follows is why? Like, looking beyond just there having been a conflict with Israel and Hamas, why exactly? And it's worth quickly noting that the conflict this time around was only around 2 weeks, if that. And if we compare that to 2014, that was about a 6 to 8 week conflict involving a ground incursion, something representing, all-out war. This wasn't quite that, and yet we've recorded what is likely to be a record number of anti-Semitic incidents. The first thing worth mentioning is the general incident context, most notably the record highs that we've had every year since 2016. 2018 was actually the first year in which we've recorded over 100 incidents each and every month, which then continued into 2019, and it didn't really continue into 2020, the only reason being that incident levels dropped when the UK went into lockdown. And as I said, this shift from 2016 onwards has happened all without there being a conflict in the Middle East involving Israel. Now, why have we seen this shift since 2016? One of the core reasons, and this has impacted on all forms of racism and prejudice across the board, has been the perceived worsening of public debate in society. We've had divisive issues like Brexit, the election of Donald Trump. It's all contributed to an emboldening of the voices and confidence of extremists. They feel more brave in expressing these views. And obviously, core to the UK picture specifically, and the big driving factor, has been anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And these combination of factors have led to this gradual shift and increase in anti-Semitism in the UK. And therefore, in some respects, it made statistical sense that a conflict set against this increase and this backdrop was always going to be larger than the previous ones. There are some other factors to consider. The pandemic and lockdown measures. Lockdown has contributed to a general increase in societal tension and frustration. Many individuals were just waiting for an excuse to let out that pent-up anger, and ultimately it was an unfortunate coincidence that coincided with this conflict this time around involving Israel. Secondly, has been the increasing relevance of social media, in particular the more visual forms of social media. And though Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat were around last time in 2014, there's been a particular growth in the use of Instagram and Snapchat, as well as the formation of social media platforms like TikTok. And ultimately, these more visual forms of social media are conducive to activism and the spread of images and videos, both from the conflict itself, as well as from the streets of the UK. And this may have had the effect of riling people up, getting more people involved, and contributing to that increase in anti-Semitism. Thirdly, has been the growing importance and relevance of what we could term social justice movements, most notably Black Lives Matter. And this has contributed to a generalized anger against perceived injustice. And we certainly saw a concerted effort by some pro-Palestinian activists to ride the coattails of Black Lives Matter. And it's just worth stating, this isn't to draw a causational link between Black Lives Matter and the increase in anti-Semitism, but to simply note the general atmosphere in which the recent conflict in Israel took place. And these combination of factors, as well as others that will come out as we do our data analysis, broadly speaking, have supercharged this spike over the last few weeks. So what have we seen? I'm just going to briefly run through and describe some of the incidents that we've recorded over the past month. A Jewish passenger on the London Underground was shouted at with the words "effing bitch, effing Nazi, Jewish bitch." 5 people on the London Underground train put up free Palestine stickers throughout the carriage, including one on a passenger's bag. When the passenger removed it, the passenger was told, "Why are you an effing Jew?" Obviously, we know the incident, the one represented at the bottom right, of the convoy of cars which drove through North London, shouting abuse and threatening the Jewish community. We had an assault of a rabbi in Chigwell. A male made a gun gesture and shouted "bang, bang, bang" as he drove past a synagogue in North London. We've had countless incidents in regards to Jewish schools where students or Jewish teachers have been targeted. We've had incidents in the workplace. A verbal altercation took place outside a synagogue and a Jewish school, directly referring to events in Israel. And these are just some of the incidents. I think I've listed, 7 or 8 there. And it's just always worth bearing in mind, and I say this every time when I talk about anti-Semitism, that each one of these incidents impacts the victim, it impacts their friends, it impacts their family, and it impacts the community more generally. And it has led to this general feeling of anxiety and fear, understandably across the community. So, what about Israel? So, I want to talk a little bit more about Israel and anti-Semitism, and it's a tough topic to cover, and it sometimes can be an even tougher topic to explain. But I suppose the main point of interest comes from understanding where that line between anti-Israel and anti-Semitic can be drawn. So I just want to spend a brief moment exploring how we can better identify what's anti-Semitic and what's not, in the hope that this may better equip you when it comes to dealing with anti-Semitism in the workplace, or when you encounter this type of rhetoric specifically relating to Israel. The easiest rule of thumb when it comes to this is where traditional anti-Semitic tropes and ideas are applied to Israel. So concepts around Jewish power, control, and money, and then when they get applied in an anti-Israel context. So I think it's worth just taking a brief look at some examples. What you can see on screen now is a Polish poster advertising the anti-Semitic propaganda pamphlet, "The Mortal Enemy of Christianity." It was written in 1943. And the image is based on an illustration which was published in the anti-Semitic German newspaper Der Stürmer in 1937. And as you can see, the poster has an image of a crucifix in front of a background of buildings that appear to be on fire, with sort of the grotesque caricature of a Jewish man looming in the background. And obviously the crucifix is a reference to the deicide myth, deicide meaning God killing, which falsely blames and condemns Jews for the death of Jesus Christ and for rejecting his teachings. And we understand this as not only being anti-Semitic, but as being one of the earliest anti-Semitic myths, which for centuries has been used to justify anti-Semitism, much of it unfortunately promoted by the church. Therefore, when we see the following placard displayed at a pro-Palestinian demo in London in 2021, it's easy for us to recognize it as anti-Semitic. It draws on that same age-old anti-Semitic trope that Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. And it's worth noting how the placard doesn't even attempt to say anything about the conflict, not that it would make it any better, but the suggestion is clear. Israel, or probably more accurately in this person's mind, the Jews, are once again undertaking a form of religious violence in the name of an evil and unjust cause. It's anti-Semitic. Let's take a look at the next example, this time focused on Jewish money and control. Once again, we can all quite easily recognize these images as being anti-Semitic. On the left is a cartoon from an anti-Semitic children's book published by Julius Streicher, once again, the publisher of Der Stürmer. And in the book, it's written, "The God of Jews is money. To earn money, he commits the greatest crimes. He will not rest until he can sit on a huge money sack, until he has become the king of money." In the middle is a poster from the British Nazi Party, the National Socialist Movement from 1962, advertising a rally in Trafalgar Square to free Britain from Jewish control. The trope of power being used again, control. You can see the fat caricature of the Jewish banker holding a whip in the shape of a pound sign, with Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberals bent over, essentially saying that Jews use their money to control the government. And on the right is an Italian wartime poster with a scene of Jewish bankers, some with American and British flags on their top hats, loaded with money bags, crossing through a path with red fields of dead Italian and British soldiers lining the sides. These three images come from completely different sources, one German, one British, and one Italian, and yet they still propagate the same tropes relating to Jews, money and control. So let's jump forward to 2021 and see what the Pakistani foreign minister has to say on CNN.
Israel is losing out. They're losing the media war despite their connections. They are losing the media war. The tide is turning.
What are their connections?
Deep pockets.
What does that mean?
Well, they're very influential people. I mean, they control media.
I mean, I would call that an anti-Semitic remark.
So I would agree with the CNN anchor that yes, that is an anti-Semitic remark. Why? Because it draws on those same tropes of Jewish money in order to gain power control, and in this case of the media, use of the term deep pockets. Jews, or in this case now Israel, is rich and uses that money to gain influence and control. And ultimately, the only reason he's saying what he is saying is because of how ingrained these anti-Semitic narratives and attitudes have become and are. These tropes rarely get used against other countries or in the same malicious way as they do against Israel. The reason why they do largely is because that deep well of anti-Semitic thoughts. It's the same anti-Semitism as we saw on the previous slide, just set within the context of 2021. And finally, the blood libel, the age-old myth that Jews would ritually sacrifice Christian children in order to use their blood for a range of religious purposes, such as mixing it into our food on Passover. On screen now are two medieval representations of the blood libel. On the left, a story of a young boy from Norwich, where the libel originated, and on the right of the screen, a story from Trento in Italy. And here they are being deployed again in an anti-Israel context. These images aren't actually particularly from 2021, but represent how these age-old tropes can get repackaged and deployed within an anti-Israel context. All show some form of representation of explicit Israeli bloodlust in which there is literal consumption of blood. It's anti-Semitic, it is the blood libel. So what about where it's not explicit or doesn't draw on these age-old tropes? This is where it starts to get difficult. And for that, we need to bear in mind the following. Context is key. Many of you may be familiar with the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's what caused quite a bit of controversy in the Labour Party in the summer of 2018 or 2019, I believe, a debate over whether or not they should adopt it. And IRA sets out a number of examples as to what could or couldn't be considered anti-Semitic. And one thing that's really important within IRA is that before it sets out the examples, it says that the following could be considered anti-Semitic, taking into account the overall context. IRA explicitly recognizes that sometimes anti-Semitism isn't binary, sometimes it isn't necessarily clear, and that we need to look at the wider context to understand when or if something is anti-Semitic, a lot of the time, especially when it comes to Israel. And when it comes to anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian activism, we have to recognize that there is very legitimate debate or argument to be had. For example, the placard that you see on screen now represent for many people legitimate statements, political statements, and we wouldn't necessarily consider these as anti-Semitic in and of themselves. But what about now? The same statements daubed on the side of a building. Still probably it falls under criminal damage, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. But what if I was to tell you that the building was a synagogue? This is an image from 2014, i.e. the last conflict of Brighton Synagogue. And this is clearly where the incident becomes anti-Semitic, targeting British Jews, their place of worship, in order to make a political point about Israel. It's anti-Semitic. And the reason why this is really important to understand is because that point I made just a little bit earlier. Context is key, but sometimes the context in which an incident has been perpetrated can be unclear. What if the graffiti you see on screen now was done on the pavement outside the synagogue? We'd probably consider that anti-Semitic, or opposite the synagogue, or down the road from the synagogue. synagogue, 200 meters or the street over from the synagogue. And these are really the challenges we face when it comes to trying to determine that line, often looking at the context between what can be considered anti-Semitic and what can be considered as anti-Israel. And I'll come on in a bit as to sort of how we can better understand the context in which an incident has been perpetrated. And I thought actually, in light of talking about the context, it's worth talking about this example from a few weeks ago on Sunday. And let's, for example, ignore for a moment what was actually shouted from the cars. Let's consider how practically, once again, somebody deciding that they want to drive with a Palestinian flag on their car in and of itself is not anti-Semitic. However, what happens when that car drives through a Jewish neighborhood? Perhaps that was simply the route they were going, or perhaps they live there. What about if they drive up and down the street several times, or decide to honk their car horns at groups of visible Jews walking down the street? The point is that there's no clear-cut formula that can help in simply separating between what can be considered as anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. That said, and as I highlighted, there are some rules of thumb that can help us when deciding. Things such as where we see those old anti-Semitic tropes being applied in a modern context against Israel. So, just moving on, and I think I want to clarify something very quickly, which is, it's worth stating that an incident doesn't necessarily have to be anti-Semitic for it to contribute to an atmosphere which could make someone Jewish feel uncomfortable. And this has come up quite a lot over the past month. We see this quite a lot with our work when it comes to incidents that come in from schools or people at the place of work, where despite the absence of explicit anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel activism that takes place can increase anxieties for Jewish students or employees. It's why we encourage schools and other organizations to listen to Jews and to their concerns. And as ever, a good rule of thumb when it comes to anti-Semitism and racism in general is to listen to the concerns of the victims. And this is something that I encourage when I give this presentation or similar presentations to sort of non-Jewish audiences. Listen to Jews, listen to their concerns, try to understand their concerns. The odds are that majority of the time that the person making the claims, the person outlining their fears is doing so in good faith, and that the feelings that they experience of anxiety are genuine. So what can you do? What can you do specifically if you find yourself victim to anti-Semitism? The first thing that's worth stating, and this is something we always say whenever we sort of advise people on what to do if they find themselves victims to anti-Semitism, is that if you are in immediate danger or you're concerned that you're in immediate physical danger, call 999. That's always the rule of thumb. Then if it's safe to do so, depending on the situation, call CST. We have a 24/7 national control room and an emergency number that takes you straight through to them. And I'll put some of the numbers you need up at the end of the presentation. So if you experience an incident, the first thing that's worth saying is the importance of recording what has actually taken place. When you're caught up in the heat of an incident, it can be quite overwhelming. And that's why it's really important to take a moment once the incident has passed to pause and consider what has just happened. Get a pen and a paper, write it down, write it on your phone, maybe record a voice note on your phone, and consider things like the date, the time, the location, what actually took place and what was actually said. Was there an offender involved, someone physically? What did they look like? Do you know their name? Were there any witnesses or CCTV? All these small pieces of information are really important in forming the full picture. And crucially, they're really important for the next stage, which is reporting. And it can sometimes seem like quite a small act. You might ask yourself the question, why should I bother? And we would always say it is totally worth reporting. There are many important reasons for reporting, and also consider reporting your incident to police on 101. Never feel as if you're going to, waste someone's time if you report something into us. You'd be surprised by the number of people who call us and are instantly apologetic because they think they're wasting our time. We have a dedicated incidents team. This is what they deal with. They are more than happy to take your calls and never feel unsure or sorry for reporting into them. So why reporting is valuable? The first is the hard data, which is really invaluable to CST, especially in our function to protect the Jewish community. It allows us to give as accurate a picture as possible to CST's partner in police and government, And it really doesn't matter how much we tell them about how bad anti-Semitism is or how the community is feeling. Without the data to back it up, those allegations almost become meaningless. We need that hard data to show them. Secondly is how it helps us in being able to discern trends and patterns. The information that you have could be the missing piece of information that's needed in a police investigation. It allows us to get the whole picture. So for example, recently, we've been observing a particular trend or pattern of anti-Semitism targeting Jewish students in school. And because we get this data, because we can start to understand those trends and those patterns, we can start thinking about next steps. What do we need to do? What do we need to do alongside other communal partners to begin to consider how do we tackle this problem? And reporting ultimately also allows us to support you as a victim. Often this can take the form of emotional support. For many people, encountering anti-Semitism can be quite a jarring experience. It's something which thankfully most British Jews don't have to deal with on a personal basis. And I'd really say that our professional incidents team are fantastic at giving victims the support they need. And finally is security. The reports that come into us can be important in helping us better protect the Jewish community physically. Sometimes someone shouting anti-Semitic verbal abuse at you may have targeted someone else. They may be on their way to a Jewish location to target other Jews. So the information that you provide is really valuable in helping protect the community. So I'm going to just finish on this last slide, which is the final aspect that many of you may be wondering is, what can we do collectively? And it's really quite a difficult question, and especially in the context of the last month. It can all sometimes feel quite rather helpless. And I think the first thing to understand is that there is no quick fix. Anti-Semitism isn't anything new. And unfortunately, I don't think, and I think many of you would agree with me, it's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. That said, it can sometimes be worth pausing and reflecting on the context of our situation. We are ultimately living in a reality and a time and a place where it's pretty good to be Jewish, being a British Jew in 2021. Polling shows that the vast majority of our fellow citizens are not only anti-Semitic and anti-Semitism, but are supportive and positive towards the Jewish community. However, that said, we have to understand there is fear. There's anguish, people are concerned. Jewish parents, as I said, are scared of sending their kids to school. Jews are unsure as to whether or not they should wear items which might identify them as Jewish. And I think it's worth understanding that these points aren't mutually exclusive. It is possible to accept that the UK is a great country in which to be Jewish, whilst also having deep-seated concerns about the long-term future of the community and the state of anti-Semitism. Education is really of paramount importance. This includes educating ourselves. I've run a number of these sessions for Jewish audiences, and often there are many aspects of anti-Semitism that people weren't previously aware of or didn't understand. And I'd really direct you to take a look at our website for many educational resources. Also, the ADL's website in the US is also very good in terms of educational resources on anti-Semitism. And educating ourselves ultimately is a really important first step to educating those around us. Where we can, we should consider how we can engage constructively with friends, family, and work colleagues. And this isn't always going to be possible, but positive, constructive engagement is really important. As I said at the very beginning of the presentation, there's not many of us. That means that many people in the UK know nothing about the community, know nothing about anti-Semitism. So sometimes we have to approach them understanding that as positively and as constructive as possible. There are people out there who are allies of the community, and there are people out there who are willing to learn and understand more about anti-Semitism. But there will be situations in which engagement isn't possible. It might be with a work colleague or some other situation. And a lot of the time, it is even just preferable to remove yourself from that situation, take note of what's happened, and then either speak to the CST or speak to management or other colleagues. And finally, what I'd say is be proud and be confident. This may seem quite counterintuitive given what's taken place over the past month, but we're stronger as a community when we stand firm and confident in who we are and what it is we believe in. The fight against anti-Semitism is never one that we actively seek out, but represents the unfortunate reality that we as Jews often have to face. It's a fight that our parents and our grandparents fought, and now it's the fight that we unfortunately are having. CST stands absolutely alongside our community, and more often than not, it is CST and our volunteers we'll stand in front of our community, protecting them from the threats we face. And if you are ever in doubt, ever concerned, or ever victimized, we are totally 100% here for you. And as I said at the end, I was just going to put some numbers up on the screen. If you want to get your phone out and take them down, or just check on our website after the presentation, it's worth saving our 24-hour national emergency number in our phone, as well as the numbers of our regional offices. It will just be more useful to you if you're ever caught up in an incident, that you can immediately have that number stored and saved. So I hope you found the presentation useful. I hope you found it informative. I know that all of this and what's been going on can be quite overwhelming at times, including for many of you in the medical profession who have encountered anti-Semitism in the workplace. And I just want to stress, this is what CST is here for, to support and protect the community, and to ensure that you're never standing alone against anti-Semitism. So I am more than happy, I know that I've gone on a bit, to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And that was a remarkable tour de force through a whole number of issues, which raise many questions in the minds of people who are on the call, as well as, and I'm sure we'll also raise more questions when we give access to the YouTube. Can I start off with questions, with a couple of immediate questions about things that are going on? Joanna Rees has raised the question of, how does one stop things like the car rallies going through? Is there a way of stopping those things that's, for example, going to happen this weekend?
Yeah.
And is there any point in getting into a discussion on Facebook? Because she went onto a doctors group and it was called a deviant trial for challenging the pro-Palestinian lobby. And Leora Harvard has raised the question of the Jewish doctors group being hacked by outsiders potentially in the last week. Those are three immediate questions which people are concerned.
Yeah, so on the car rallies themselves, we fully understand how harrowing and sort of anxiety-inducing they have been for the community. We have seen the car rallies deliberately targeting Jewish neighborhoods, and obviously that prominent incident that took place on the Finchley Road. In terms of, can we stop them full out? Legally speaking, I don't think it's possible. Individuals are within their right to do that. They are not within their right, of course, to target Jewish communities. They are not in their right to harass and sort of promote anti-Semitism on the streets of the UK. The one thing that I would say is I hope you can be confident, and we hope as an organisation at CST that we can be confident in the police themselves to take action. So take, for example, the convoy that's getting some attention online for this weekend. We've been aware of it. We're working with police to ensure that the route that they take goes nowhere near our community, and that to ensure that the police do all they can to enforce that, whilst also having to unfortunately recognise just the difficulties of being able to control people in their cars. And we will be putting on extra reassurance patrols, doing what we need to do from a security perspective to ensure that the community is safe. So I hope that kind of reassures you on that question. In terms of worth getting in discussions online, so in terms of some context of my role, part of my role is as a research analyst at CST. That deals with looking at the anti-Semitism online on a daily basis, and I've done that for the past 5.5 years. Ultimately, it's a personal decision, but my assessment of the online world is that it's not a very conducive environment for debate. It's not a very conducive environment to have these arguments, and a lot of the time they end up with abuse, especially when it comes to issues around Israel-Palestine. And we get, many incidents of people who get into these arguments and then end up suffering anti-Semitic abuse online. Ultimately, it's going to be a personal decision. But if it was me personally, if that's something which is frustrating me, if I'm getting worked up, getting into these arguments online, I'm removing myself from the situation because I don't need that. And there's an unfortunate reality that there's always going to be people promoting this stuff online. If you do come across anti-Semitism, feel free to report it into us. We work closely with the social media companies, constructively or as constructively as possible at times to ensure that they're taking action against anti-Semitism. In terms of the Jewish Doctors Group and the WhatsApp group specifically, I'm not aware of that particular incident. The one thing I would say is that as the community moves more online, which we've seen for the past 10, 15, 20 years, we need to take very seriously cybersecurity. That's something that we're doing more and more of at CST. We have guidance online on our website relating to cybersecurity, personal cybersecurity if you're hosting a Zoom meeting, for example. I would direct you to take a look at that. But there's kind of like small steps that you can take to ensure that you're ensuring the security of sort of yourself online. Two-factor verification. Do you know everyone in your WhatsApp group? You know, you should make yourself as the only admin in the WhatsApp group, so it's only you who can add people into the group, not other people. These small steps are really important to kind of protect ourselves online, because that really is the next frontier that we're moving into more and more of at the moment.
Right. Now, there is the question raised about intellectual anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism in relation to academia and universities. And John Grabner queries whether young people might not go to university because of that kind of factor. And Jack Solomon raises the question that the largest threat, he believes, is the Muslim anti-Semitism. And what are we doing specifically about Muslim anti-Semitism?
So in regards to intellectual anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism at universities, it is an issue. It's been an issue for a number of years. Sometimes anti-Semitism can feel like everything changes and nothing changes. You know, these were debates and arguments that were being had in the 70s and the 80s when local JSOCs, Jewish societies, were getting banned from universities because they wouldn't publicly renounce Zionism. And obviously within that, you've obviously got the specific problem of academics who might engage in anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, there have been incidents where Jewish students have felt like they don't want to attend particular universities because they feel that the atmosphere being promoted is sort of conducive to anti-Semitism. And we can see that quite explicitly. The reason why we have universities where large numbers of Jewish students go, you have things like convenience, provision of kosher food, but also Jewish students and parents need to feel confident that the university they're sending their child to or the university they're going to is safe and that there isn't anti-Semitism. And we kind of see that shifting and changing a lot of the time. So in the early 2000s, Manchester was quite popular with Jewish students. And there were a number of high-profile incidents which took place. And actually, we saw numbers start to reduce. At the moment, we have a particular issue in regards to Bristol University with a particular academic. And a lot of the time, the reason why we want universities to take action beyond tackling the anti-Semitism itself is because we know if they don't deal with it, that Jewish students will start to choose to go elsewhere because they don't feel safe. They feel that the university isn't going to take anti-Semitism seriously. UJS, Union of Jewish Students, do really good work on this front. It's something that we're keenly aware of, and we work extensively with contacts in government, like the universities minister, to ensure that universities understand their responsibilities. Lord Mann is on quite a good crusade at the moment to ensure that universities, or as many universities as possible, are adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a really positive step. So it's something that's, I think, unfortunately going to continue. In regards to the Muslim community and anti-Semitic attitudes within the Muslim community, it is unfortunately, there is a problem. We know that there are anti-Semitic attitudes within parts of the Muslim community. There are anti-Semitic attitudes in various different communities. And I think polling shows, when polling was taking place, that in regards to context and relative to other communities, anti-Semitism within the Muslim community is higher. In terms of what can we do? It's a really tough question. And you're sometimes trying to get the balance between wanting to take on anti-Semitism, you know, being forthright and taking action, whilst also engaging. And how do you get that balance? How do you engage and how do you be forthright? And I think it's worth stating that this is in no way a lost cause. There are many allies within the Muslim communities. Many of you may have seen an organization called Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, who alongside the Jewish Leadership Council took out advertisements across all the main national newspapers, stipulating their support for the Jewish community in light of the latest wave of anti-Semitism. We work extensively with Tel Mama, who are sort of a Muslim community equivalent of ourselves, in helping them to record incidents, and we get a lot of solidarity and support from them. So where there are allies, where there is support, of which there is lots, especially within a community with so many people, we should be seeking out to forge those relationships, engage and build constructively, because we can't take the position that it's a lost cause. We can't deal with that, because if we want our future to be in this country, we want to live sort of constructively and positively alongside our fellow citizens, be it Muslim or not, we have to engage and educate as much as possible.
You've answered really the question, is anyone having conversation with universities? Because you've suggested the Lord Man. Joanna, coming back on your answer about the CSTs, that she felt she had no feedback and she felt very unsafe as in the where she worked at a workplace. And is there a way of communicating victims and reassuring them? Is there a particular route that's used by the CST for that? And
so yeah, go on.
What that was after and also the video where Jews accused of spilling blood, isn't that incitement to violence? Isn't that actually a criminal kind of?
So if I can briefly address the point about, because a lot of questions sometimes we get up, what is CST actually doing? We've had a lot of high-profile incidents. I can't stress enough how much the organization's been working over the past month. I've been working weekends till 11 midnight. Many of my colleagues have been doing the same. Our volunteers have been doing the same, doing security shifts. Our primary and initial focus during that time period and during the conflict is to ensure the security and the protection of the community here and now. We need to ensure that somebody being radicalized, that somebody who is inspired or angry by what's going on, who then wants to go and attack the community, is stopped and isn't given the opportunity to do so. So that is always going to be our first priority. I didn't even mention in the presentation, which I was going to, that over the period when there was conflict, we had statements from Islamic State, Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, all promoting attacks on Jews, not just in Israel, but worldwide. And that impacts how we do our security, that impacts our assessment. So our first priority is always going to be the immediate security of the community. Beyond that is obviously the work that needs to be done alongside police and alongside government to ensure where high-profile anti-Semitic incidents have taken place, that there is action taken by the police. And we're kind of in the process of doing that now on the basis of a sort of backlog, because we've had a lot of anti-Semitism. And it's worth stating that the incidents that you see in the news and in the media are just that. We have hundreds of incidents which aren't in the media, which need dealing with as well. But we are now working with police to ensure that the most high-profile incidents are followed up and action is being taken against. So let's take, for example, the car convoy that took place on Finchley Road. It was actually CST and the team that I work as part of who identified the registration plate of the car using sort of online methods. And we fed that into the police and they then resulted in made arrest. We're in the process of submitting more witness statements to the police to ensure that they can take further arrests based on some of the anti-Semitism or the high-profile incidents of anti-Semitism. In terms of the previous question that I think was Joanna asked, I wasn't entirely clear what it was she was asking.
She was asking about the response to her call. What happened?
Okay.
Why was she not getting a response?
So look, in terms of if you've had a bad response or no response at all, I can only apologise. I would ask you to be patient with us at the moment. We have been worked ragged over the past month, and we are dealing with a backlog. And it is taking us a while to get round to victims and individuals who've been subject to anti-Semitism. Because of the nature of what it is, we obviously have to triage and prioritise those incidents which might relate to a physical threat or somebody being targeted physically. But in your case, I can't comment specifically, but do feel free to follow up with me personally, and I'll ensure that somebody gets back to you from our incidents team.
Michael Wax commented that he was the person who was actually hacked, and he reported that to the CST and to the police. Before I get onto some, there are also some. I hope you don't mind carrying on, but there are also some general thought questions that have been raised. One is the question from Jack Solomon is, how do we convince the government that some strong action needs to be taken using the French situation as the model, where Jewish communities and Jewish lives have been under attack and threatened, and indeed some people have apparently been killed in anti-Semitic.
I mean, look,
how do we convince the government about that?
It's an ongoing, I wouldn't say a battle, because we at the moment are lucky and I think in a good position with the current government, and we're obviously in the process of building back our relationship with the opposition, and I think that there's positive steps being taken there. With the current government, they are good on our issues. They do listen, they take them seriously. I can give countless examples of how they do that, the most explicit being the meeting that my chief executive had alongside other communal members, including the chief rabbi, a few weeks ago with the Prime Minister in regards to this latest wave of anti-Semitism. We had visits from the Home Secretary and the Community Secretary to the Jewish community, once again to provide reassurance and support. It can sometimes feel like empty words, but it's also been reflected in sort of support for the community. I suppose best case example is the government grant, which they've been giving to the community since 2015, of money that CST then administers, which goes to protecting the community and communal locations. So on commercial guards for Jewish schools, for example, and guards outside key Jewish sites. So I don't know if we're in a position where we need to convince them further. I think it's something that we continue to do. We're very lucky to be in a position where we do have those good relationships and where the community can feel confident enough to engage with the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister. But I don't think it's something we can let slip, because I think what happened with the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn was as good/bad as a warning as we could possibly get about how quickly things can change. And we've got to be vigilant to that. There was another question in there, David?
Yes, there's also the question, the philosophical question about if we polarize things very briefly, are we better off ghettoizing ourselves and keeping within secure clusters, or should we be integrating more into the wider society? And there are risks in both strategies. Where do we draw the balance in those two?
Yeah, it's really tough. And, these go into really big issues about the community now, the community in the past, and how we see the community in the future. I think, and this is something that I'll always promote, is that tactics don't have to be mutually exclusive. We don't need to sit at one end of the scale. And I think sometimes the danger is we not overreact, but our response can sometimes push us to one extreme, where sometimes we have to keep a cool and level head. We need to look at the context as a whole, and we kind of need to then decide what the best path is. And I would kind of always say that the best path, and in relation to this, will always be somewhere in the middle. I understand that certain parts of the community will feel fearful. There'll be parts of the community who keep themselves more to themselves, the ultra-Orthodox community or the Haredi community, more specifically being an example of that. But we do have allies. We are not completely alone. And I will keep saying that. It can feel like we're completely alone. And the last month, I'm sure for many of us, kind of felt like we were at points. But there are allies out there, starting with, for example, the government, who have been very good, but also from other communities who have given support. And beyond me just saying that, all I can say is that all the data, all the polling that we do shows that the vast, vast majority of our fellow Brits, non-Jewish, are supportive of the Jewish community, are positive towards the community, and do not like anti-Semitism. When the Corbyn issue was going on, polling actually showed that the vast majority of Brits perceived anti-Semitism to be fundamentally un-British. And these stats reassure me, and I kind of hope that they might do for some of the audience as well, because we do have allies out there, we have supporters out there, we have people who will stand alongside us out there. But I suppose the very fact that CST exists is a testament to sometimes we just have to roll our own sleeves up to get out there and protect ourselves. And it's going to be a continued struggle, battle, and debate that's going to be had going forward.
Right. There are two work-related ones. One is LinkedIn. How is LinkedIn? LinkedIn is a business platform, and there are anti-Semitic tropes that occur on LinkedIn. It's not only Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. How is that? How is that controlled? And that's the one work-related one. The other work-related one has been raised is the question of the General Medical Council and referral to the General Medical Council. That's one, of course, I can partially answer, in that we wrote to the General Medical Council, and the General Medical Council's reply basically gave a catalogue of the clauses in all their guidelines and documents, which could be usefully invoked were we to report cases to them. And it's also flags up the position of professional regulators and that they are trying to address that other professional regulators follow the same rules as they do in that regard. But are you active with regard to professional regulators and providing education to them?
So on the point of LinkedIn, it's a really hard thing to say, but the internet, the online world, is a great wild west. And the anti-Semitism that many of you will come across online is a real drop in the ocean as to what there is. And it can sometimes be disheartening to see. It can be hard to see. You kind of go, why is this allowed? It's a struggle. It's a battle. It's something that we're trying to engage with the companies, LinkedIn also included. But I suppose the harshest reality of this is that you're never going to be able to get to a point zero where there is no anti-Semitism online. What you kind of need to ensure is that the social media companies and companies like LinkedIn have the processes and procedures in place to deal with it in the first place. So always first port of call will be reporting it into LinkedIn via whatever structures that they have. Hopefully you get a sufficient outcome as a result of that. If not, I think you can appeal it. And then once again, I would kind of encourage you to speak to us in regards to that. In terms of the GMC, I think the question you were asking is about our engagement with sort of bodies like that. Where we need to have engagement with bodies like that, we will do. Just honestly speaking, I'm unsure in regards to CST's previous engagements with the GMC and what we've done. But, if, for example, through the JMA or through any number of medical professionals who feel as if this is a particular issue, which I get the sense that it is, the organization would obviously be more than happy to sort of engage with them. And it could even take the form of providing anti-Semitism training to them so that they can understand, recognize what is and isn't anti-Semitic. That's something that we've done for other bodies. One of my colleagues did that for the Labour Party after the changes they went through with Corbyn to help their team understanding and recognizing anti-Semitism. So if that is something that we feel could be of use going forward, then perhaps we could set that up. And it's also worth considering other communal partners like Board of Deputies and how they can help engage on these issues.
I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but Daniel Sahetsky from JPR asked the question, is there going to be a point when you turn around and say, there's no longer a future, things are so bad, and we need to kind of get up and go? Is that, yeah. Does anybody have that doomsday thought process within the CST?
Well, it's good to see Daniel on the call. Much of his work at JPR has been really important, and I know that we've done a lot of work cross-organisationally with them. Look, we don't have a book or a line that sort of says at this moment it's time to go. And as a communal organisation, we don't have the capacity to tell parts of the Jewish community how to feel, what is their threshold. For many, that threshold may have been reached, and many of you may know people who have already moved to Israel or gone to the States, etc. Others may take a very different view. Some may take the view of kind of standing, fighting, fighting for our future in the country. There isn't going to be one particular point. I suppose where there is a relation to CST in the work that we do is we can take guidance and we can sort of take examples from other Jewish communities internationally. And I suppose where our concern is, and the reason why we ultimately do the work that we do, and I have to explain this sometimes when I give presentations to police, because police find the concept of a communal security group quite bizarre, is I explain to them the reason why we do what we do, the reason why we protect the community from physical threats relating predominantly to anti-Jewish terrorism is because those stakes are so high, because of what we've seen in France. France had the attacks in Toulouse, it had the attacks then in Paris on the kosher supermarket in 2015. The attack on Toulouse resulted in Jewish children being killed at a school. The attack in Paris targeted Jewish shoppers who were at a kosher supermarket on a Friday, and people left. People felt that they didn't have a future anymore in the country. Why? Because they didn't feel safe sending their kids to school. They didn't feel safe going into a kosher supermarket. And this really is what motivates and guides CST to do the work that we do. Because we understand that if, God forbid, 1 million times anything were to happen here, talking specifically now about terrorism, it would have that impact for a lot of people. That's why we're passionate about what we do. That's why every day we're motivated to protect the community and to ensure that that never does happen. Look at Argentina from 1994 with the AMIA bombing, the community building being killed, I think 86 people murdered. It decimated the community. So these are examples of stark reminders and can be instructive as to maybe where that point is for many people. And CST sure as hell are going to continue working to ensure we never have that, to ensure that we're working with police, if that's referring individuals we think might go on to commit terrorist acts, or just physically protecting the community, to make sure that if somebody wants to come and do something, well, they have to get through a lot first before they can do it. That can be CCTV, gates, target hardened locations, as well as our volunteers. So the work continues to ensure that we never get to that point.
Danny, I think that, under normal circumstances, one might turn around at this point and say, well, we've had our money's worth, but that would clearly be inappropriate. We've extracted more than our pound of flesh. That would also be inappropriate. What I do think is appropriate, though, is to say that it's a testimony to and a tribute to the work you've done and the way you've explained it, that we've gone on far longer than we've normally able to go on for, the questions that have arisen have actually been things that you've addressed as clearly as you possibly can, and given, and I hope, encouragement to people, the feeling that you aren't alone, that there is somebody out there thinking about these things is itself hugely reassuring. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for what you've done tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.